to the Fruity Knitting Podcast. This is episode 31. I'm Andrea.
And I'm Andrew.
And we've got a full and exciting show for you today with 4 guests. Our interview guest is Carson Demers, who's recently authored and published the book Knitting Comfortably, the Ergonomics of Knitting. And he's going to teach us how to stay injury-free while we knit obsessively or spin obsessively or weave obsessively or play with fibre in general.
Obsessively, yes.
Obsessively.
We're travelling to Helsinki, Finland to meet our guest on Knitters of the World. We're then going down to the German woods to visit a place of an ancient site of
Celtic worship
for our extreme knitting episode.
Yeah.
Andrea's giving us another sewing tutorial while she's still off her knitting regime.
Yeah.
And we're introducing a new segment, which is really exciting.
Yay.
Contact details of all of our guests and full program notes can be found on our website at fruityknitting.com, so make sure you check that out.
Yeah. So we'll start off with under construction because Andrew is doing extremely well with his Fair Isle.
This is my very first Fair Isle project. We discussed this in the last episode. Andrea said she thought the Booster Beanie by Gudrun Johnson would be a great project to start as a first Fair Isle project. And I took it on, and I must say, I think she was absolutely right. I think it's a great project as a first project. The reasons for that are, firstly, the pattern on the colour work.
Oh, the colour work,
bit here it's a geometric pattern, which means that it's quite easy. It's a 4-stitch repeat, so you do the same thing every 4 stitches right round the whole round. That makes it easy. You can look at what you've done on the row before and you can really figure out what you should be doing out this row. It's quite simple. Nevertheless, it looks absolutely beautiful. Andrea figured out these colours based on my Firebirds jumper. It's actually leftover wool from that project. The colours here work beautifully, but I'm sure you can use lots of different colour combinations and still come up with a beautiful result. And although it's a very simple pattern, it just comes together really nicely. The fact that the stitches aren't just squares like they're drawn on the pattern, but they're actually a bit textured, makes the curves come out, and it's really lovely.
And he's been doing it two-handed.
Yeah.
I am completely surprised at how well Andrew has taken to this. He's taken to it like a duck to water. We're
both pretty surprised. I wasn't expecting to get along as well as I have. Just quickly, you can show the inside. The other thing is it's a 4-stitch repeat. You don't have long floats, so I don't have to worry about weaving in the floats.
Yeah.
So that makes it simple as well. What I have noticed, it's really good work here. What I have noticed is it's all about the tension, and that's what I find particularly difficult, or what I have to keep starting again on my left hand. I have to grab the wool again because the tension just sort of gets out of control. It's either too tight or it gets just really loose and I can't really do anything, or I've got my fingers sticking out.
So you're meaning that the wool, as it's woven through your fingers, it's either ends up catching and gets too tight or else it's too loose.
Yeah. And I think that's probably, like other things, it's a combination of practice and looking at the technique. Yeah. So, but I'm really pleased with how it's coming on. The other thing that's really great, if you're going to do something like this, do a shawl beforehand and then do a hat. And then it's just, you got these short rows. Not short rows in the technical sense, but short rows in just the fact that they're shorter, which is kind of satisfying because this comes along quite quickly.
So for somebody who is a cable lover and not much interested in colour like you, I am so surprised.
Don't say that. I'll get hate mail.
That you're actually taken to this so well. And he actually had his first two-handed Fair Isle lesson during a live event. We had a live knit and chat session with our Shetland patrons, and I hadn't had time to teach him how to do it beforehand. So I gave him some quick instructions during this live event under the watchful eyes of our patrons.
So we were on video. I have to say I kept the knitting down out of the sight of the camera, but they could see my face.
Yes. Which wasn't a happy face.
Probably revealed a little bit. But it's gone very well. I'm really enjoying it. So it's good.
So the pattern recommends the Jamieson and Smith 2-ply jumper weight, which is fantastic because it has a great range of colours and it's beautiful to work with. So if you have an option to work with that yarn, I'd recommend it. And if any of you haven't done the two-handed Fair Isle yet, why don't you grab this pattern? It's a free pattern from the Shetland Wool Week. You just have to sign up and join Andrew.
Yep.
So, Andrew, you have to leave us now because Madeleine is coming to join us. Yes. Bye. Madeleine's joining us on this episode. She was on that podcast 2 episodes ago, and she's going to give us a little update on her knitting.
Yeah.
So welcome, Madeleine.
Thank you. You might remember last time, it was 2 episodes ago, I was actually about to have my oral exams, and since then I've finished my oral exams and I'm done with school.
And she did really well. We're very proud of her.
Yeah, I'm very proud as well. And since then I've been working in a cafe as well as modelling to earn some money for my Australia trip.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're hoping she's going to go in October. She's hopefully only stay 6 months and then come back and go to uni.
Yeah.
So show us what you've been knitting.
Well, this is the back piece of the jumper that I've been knitting. I showed you this last time already. It's the Atlantic by Sarah Hatton, and you can find it in the Rowan Knitting Magazine number 61. It's knitted in pieces from the bottom up and has raglan sleeves, as you can see here. And the yarn itself is really soft and silky. It's the Softjack DK weight yarn by Rowan as well. Yeah, and I use these 3 colours for it.
Which look really beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, since then I have knitted the front as well. And let's see how observant you are. You might notice something. It's a bit long. I actually added 20 extra rows to it.
Well, carried away.
Exactly, I was carried away listening to a whole lot of podcasts.
So this red section is longer than this red section.
Yes. Anyway, so I've got a long front and a short back, and so now I get to decide in the end if I want a long or a short jumper. But before we do that, I'm going to knit the 2 sleeves first and then see which version I prefer. I'll probably go with the short one, but either way, we'll have to graft. Mum made a tutorial on that once.
So what you have to do is just cut the knitting open, and we'll either unravel 20 rows and then graft it back together, or cut the knitting open and knit 20 rows and graft it back together. So we don't have to decide on that just yet. Yeah. We'll do the sleeves first and then see what version you like. But I'm opting for the short one.
Yeah, I mean, although I feel like an idiot, I think either way I'm still happy with the end product.
Yeah, cool, okay. And what are you wearing?
So I'm wearing the dress that Mum made me recently. I like it very much. It's very comfortable and has a bit of a...
looks great.
What do you call it when it kind of swings a bit?
It's got a swishy skirt on it.
Yeah.
Cool. And you're going off to work in the cafe this afternoon?
Yes, I better get going.
Yes. Bye.
Bye.
My name is Donna Smith, and I'm going to speak to you today about my latest design, the Papal Beret, which is what I'm wearing, and also what's on the model here. The beret was inspired by this tin here. This is a tin that 2 Dutch friends took to me last year when they visited Shetland Wool Week. That was Madeleine and Marijke from the Netherlands. I met them at the workshop that I was running in Papel, which is a little village just south of where I live on the island of Burra, and they were also living in a cottage in Papel as well, so it seemed appropriate to name the berets after the place that we met and the place that they were staying. Also at the end of last year I got asked to go over to the Netherlands to teach at a Dutch knitting festival, the Dutch Knitting Days in Rijstvik, and I was asked to design a pattern for Troei magazine, and I'm not sure if I've pronounced it correctly, so if I haven't then I apologise. And what I decided to do was to take the tin and get inspiration from the tin. It seemed appropriate, so I made the Papel mitts with the tulips, and also with the circles and the oval shapes, which were inspired by the houses on this tin here. And I took the colours from the tin as well, or I was inspired by the colours on the tin. So those are the Papel mitts, and then that led on to making a beret to match. So this is the Papal Beret, and again it's got the tulips and also the oval shapes and the circles as well, inspired by the windows on the tin. It's cast on, you cast on a rib, which is a lining, and then you knit a row of holes, which then is turned back to form the picot edging. And it's also got a row of purl, or two rows of purl here to give it a bit of texture. And you can see here the crown is got the circles on it as well. I always like to knit crowns because I tend to design them on paper, so it's always really interesting to see how different they look when they're knitted up. The beret is knitted in Jamieson's of Shetland Spindrift, which is jumper weight, or a fingering weight Shetland wool, and there's a huge variety of colours available, so you can make the hat in a huge number of colourways. So I hope you like it, and we hopefully speak to you again soon.
Welcome back. That was our new segment, New Releases. We will be featuring independent designers presenting their newly released patterns to give us some inspiration.
Yes.
And to tell us a bit about what it was for them, what their thoughts behind it were.
Yeah.
I thought Donna did a beautiful job there. We were really pleased that she could launch the segment with her contribution. Beautifully done. And a beautiful pattern. I think
Stunning pattern.
I think you've got your eye on it.
I do.
I get
for
the
you,
feeling. Yeah.
to knit for me.
Yeah, I get the feeling you might be thinking, you've got enough socks and now you're going to start giving me hat commissions.
Instructions, yes.
Fair old hat commissions, yeah.
Well, you're doing so well, Dales, and her design is beautiful.
Yep.
I particularly like it with the grey, that sort of grey, and then the tulips really stand out.
Very classy.
And I think you can manage it. You've proved yourself.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I put together a little introduction for that segment. I hope you enjoyed it. That's the Eroica Symphony by Beethoven. You chose that.
Yes, I chose the music. The graphics is a little silly, but we do find it fun, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Yeah, we know knitting podcasters like the random number generator, so there was a bit of random number generator in there.
So I'm going to show you now, or talk a little bit more about my sewing adventures. And as you can see, I'm wearing a new dress, which I've sewn. And if you watch the last couple of episodes, you'll recognise that the pattern of this dress is the same as the pattern of my previous dress. And I was using the very easy Vogue, so that's V8993. And because it worked so well, it was successful, I thought I've got to do another one, particularly when I saw this lovely crisp white fresh material. So it's a great design actually to learn or to practice different things with sewing. It's the bodice is very fitted, so you have to learn a lot about fitting to do that. And there's princess line seams here, which is good. There's a seam going right down the middle. There's a little collar, and the bodice is also lined. And then the front of the skirt has got more material than the back because it's got two pleats here, and then there's a zipper in the back. So I'm going to stand up just so you can see how well it fits me, because it fits me really well and I'm really proud.
Stand up, give us a look. It does fit you absolutely beautifully, Dales.
Yeah.
All those curves. Tell me, did you, in doing the second edition of this dress, did you learn anything new?
Yes.
Or did you do anything better?
Yes, I did quite a few things better. I actually, because I saw that McCall's pattern tutorial, I actually went down a size. And
that's right.
then I
assumed,
so I measured the bust across here, so underneath the shoulder blades and up above the bust.
Yep.
And that gives you a closer idea of which pattern size to take. You have to look into that. I talked more about that 2 episodes ago. But so therefore I started with a size lower, and that helped me. I had to do less adjustments everywhere here.
Yeah.
And also, because I've got a sway back, I need to cut out more material on my back. My back is actually shorter because it's a sway back. It's just the way it is. So I knew to do that immediately, and that saved me a lot of fitting afterwards.
Yeah.
So I put just an elastic around my waist to see where it was just on the bodice, and I could see that my bodice was hanging quite low underneath that elastic, even though when you take it off and measure it, it shouldn't look like that.
Yep.
So that was interesting. And also on the hem, I don't know, without lifting my skirt up too high, I do something which I like on the hem. I don't know that a lot of people do it, but first I get a little bit of lace and I attach the bottom of the material to the lace, and then I hand sew the lace so that if it flares up, it's got this pretty little detail.
Yeah.
But there's always material left over when you do a dress, and so I have sewn my little niece Simba a dress as well. And this is it here. I think it's super, super cute. You might remember a couple of episodes when I sewed this dress in this material. I also sewed this little dress for Simba. It's a 60s style. So this one is for a 4-year-old and for a 4-year-old size, and it's got no sleeves. It is lined. This time I picked this nice sort of soft cream lining to go with this. And this one is the same pattern, but it's for a 3-year-old because I think they look quite big sizes. And I've put on cap sleeves. And it's also lined, but I lined it with the fresh white. And I used, if you just don't mind holding that for me, I used bias binding instead of ribbon here for the ending because the material is cotton with about 5% elastin, and bias binding also has a bit of a stretch. So it kind of suits it very well. And as well, I was able to get the exact colour I wanted. So I think that's such a cute little dress. It's so cute, I would actually like to get in it myself and wear it. And I do think that this material translates better into a little girl's dress than this material.
This one here.
That's very sophisticated.
This is one sophisticated little girl.
It is. It's a dress that the 4-year-old would take herself off to the opera.
But she'll probably enjoy this too, I reckon.
Yeah. Or a wedding, to go to a wedding. It's very sophisticated. And this is a little bit more little girly.
Or in the sandbox. Probably more likely.
More likely, yeah. Okay. So I'm very pleased with these little dresses. It was fun to whip them up, and it's great to be able to do something with the leftover material of a dress. What I do want to say, one more thing, is for me, I'm an absolute knitter at heart, not a sewer, but there's a few things that I like about sewing. The first thing is planning the project, so picking out a pattern and picking some material that goes with it and getting excited about the end product. That's a major attraction to sewing.
I just want to jump in. There is also the attraction of actually getting a dress.
Yes, that's, yeah.
Which you did enjoy.
But there's a whole lot in between, which is debatable as to how pleasurable it is. Yeah. But one part that I do find pleasurable is understitching, lining or facing. So many of you who sew will be familiar with this, but what it does is it stops your facing or the inside of the garments from rolling out and showing. And I'm a bit of a detail nerd, so for me, I love it because it gives such a crisp, professional finish, like for this lovely neckline here, that it just gives me such a wonderful sense of satisfaction. So I thought, even though my sewing skills are not up to my knitting skills, that I would do a 2-minute tutorial on the beauty of understitching your facing or lining. So I hope you enjoy it. For me, one of the most satisfying things about sewing a dress is understitching my lining. It's really annoying to have the lining or the facing of your dress peeking up from the inside of your garment, and understitching solves this problem. So I've got an example here of a finished dress for a 4-year-old girl where you can see my understitching around the neckline here and around the armholes here. So understitching is simply stitching a line close to the edge of the lining or the facing to keep it from rolling towards the outside. It's particularly good to use around the neckline and the armholes, and it keeps the facing or the lining firmly on the inside of the garment without any stitches showing on the outside, which is a really professional finish. So I'm going to show you the process on this dress, which is the same pattern as the one I've already showed you, only one size smaller. So this is the bodice of the dress, and this is the back where the zipper will go. That's the armhole. So the first thing you'll do is sew the lining and the fabric together, and then you'll trim the seam. So I've trimmed my seam in layers to help reduce the bulk, and because it's curved, you'll also cut out some notches. You then press the lining or the facing towards the seam allowance, and with a straight stitch, you'll be stitching 2 or 3 millimeters from the seam line all along the edge. And I'll show you how to do that now. So next you give the fabric a final press, which I've already done, and then you're finished. So on the outside you won't see any stitches, and your lining or your facing will now lie really flat with a crisp edge. This is the little sleeve that I've done, and you can see on the inside of the sleeve that it's a really crisp edge, preventing the lining from rolling out of place. So it's a really professional ending, and it's really satisfying.
We are going to stretch our legs, get a little bit of fresh air, and take a walk in the Pfalz region in the German woods. This footage was taken about 3 weeks ago, I think, when the spring leaves were first starting to bud in the woods.
Yeah, and the Germans really love and appreciate the time of the seasons turning, and the excitement about when normally all of the gardens in the wooded area, which normally looks very dead, suddenly becomes very green and full of fresh new life. And they've actually got a word for it. It's an old German word, Waldespracht, which is the splendor of the forests. And you can really see that Germany loves their forests, because the combined forest area of Germany and Austria is actually the largest, or represents the largest wooded area in all of Europe. And you can see that when you're flying into Frankfurt, because you'll see a whole lot of woodlands and just little villages scattered around. So they've done a lot to keep up the quality of the landscape that way.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the woods are much more of a sort of part of daily life, is my impression.
Yeah.
There are still people who collect firewood to burn for heating in the woods, and the number of people out walking in the woods during summer is really extraordinary.
Particularly on a Sunday afternoon.
And
is
whole
a typical
families,
thing.
any ages.
Yeah. So for our hike, I picked very appropriate music, a great German composer, Beethoven, and his 5th violin sonata, which is a gorgeous sonata, and it's commonly known as the Spring Sonata. And it's full of expectancy and the joy of new life coming. So I hope you enjoy it.
and I live in Helsinki in Finland. I got into knitting back in the winter of 2013 and 14 after I had discovered some sewing blogs where the seamstresses also made their own cardigans and sweaters. Before that, I had always thought that reading knitting patterns was really difficult, and I had never thought of knitting anything myself. But now I decided to try it out, so I found an easy looking pattern and I got myself the materials and started knitting. And I was amazed at how easy it was. The reason for this was, of course, that I had learned how to knit as a child. Although I had never made anything, I still knew the basics. So it was a really easy start for me when I actually got into knitting. I never finished my first attempt at knitting a cardigan because it was stockinette stitch, and I pretty soon found that I wanted more of a challenge. So I decided to knit this pattern, which is a 1940s pattern called Lady Trellis Joke Jumper. As you can see, it has a bit of a cable. This is not my first attempt at this pattern. My first one came out a bit too short and my seaming wasn't that great, as you might imagine, it being my first knit. But I was really proud of this one when I finished it, because it's still, it looks really great in my opinion. Pretty soon after I started knitting, I bought Susan Crawford's A Stitch in Time, which is a really good book, especially for people who live in countries where there aren't that many vintage knitting patterns. And my first knit from that one was this one, which is called Kasha. It's also a 1940s pattern. This is also my first attempt at lace. Overall, it's a pretty intuitive pattern. The only difficult thing is how to purl 5 together. But before I made this, I had read Tom of Holland's blog where he does give advice of how to make them. I guess knitting stranded is a big stepping stone for most knitters, as it was for me. And about a year after I started knitting, I decided to knit my first stranded cardigan, which was this one. It's a pattern by Geoffrey Honeycutt called Shetland Rose Cardigan. It's one of the few new patterns I've used. So I actually knit continental style, which is what I learned as a child. But pretty soon after I started knitting, I tried knitting English. And I do feel that English style is a bit more intuitive, but I do still have a hard time keeping the yarn tight. Not when I knit, but when I purl. So I don't use English otherwise from when I knit stranded. I enjoy knitting stranded a lot because I feel it's a pretty fast way of knitting, of course depending on the pattern. My favorite stranded knit at the moment is this one, which is a 1960s pattern by Liv Tolsvand called Haukeli. I was initially inspired to knit this one because it has 3 yarn colors on some rows, which I thought would be interesting to try out. And I'm proud of this one because I made a lot of changes to the sizing, and I think it turned out pretty well. Another thing I like about this pattern is that when you're wearing it, the sleeves and the body actually match up. Last year, when I was Googling, I stumbled upon this pattern, which I guess is a 1950s pattern. It's called Danish Fair Isle. And from looking at the pattern, I knew it would be really time-consuming to make because it's actually in tarsia and it's knitted in the flat. It has lots of colors on each row and is pretty much impossible to memorize. But I decided I wanted a challenge, and yeah, I made this one. I'm really happy with the end result, although it did take me some months to make.
Thank you very much to Christa from Helsinki in Finland. Christa is a very adventurous knitter, jumping straight into the more challenging stuff. Wasn't satisfied with doing a bit of stocking stitch. It's very impressive.
Yeah.
Beautiful results. So thank you, Christa, for that contribution and for the inspiration that you've given us.
We really appreciate you deciding to spend time watching our podcast. There's a lot of different types of knitting podcasts available. If you particularly enjoy and appreciate how we run our program, we would ask you to consider becoming a patron. Every episode we do say this, but the logistics of organising and planning and filming and editing the content of our program, which we hope is very high quality content and very diverse, is close to a full-time job, and we do need more patrons to make it viable for us to continue long term. We've got some really generous patrons, and we're incredibly grateful for them. Not everybody can give so generously, but you can become a patron for just the cost of 2 coffees per month, which the majority of people can afford. I do appreciate that it is much easier, or might even feel more natural, to pay for something physical that you can get in your hands, and that there's a lot of free entertainment available. But nevertheless, to make the program that we do and present for you, it takes such a lot of time that it is no longer in the hobby category. And because there's only so much time in a week and we have to work to pay the bills, we do need it to be financially supported. And we don't have sponsorship and we don't have advertising, so this is how we do it. So we ask you that if you particularly enjoy our program or particularly value it, to consider becoming a patron. You can do that on our by going to our Fruity Knitting website. It'll have a link there to take you straight to Patreon, or this link here below. Thank you very much.
Over on our Ravelry page, one of our viewers has created a thread called Fans of Fruity Knitting Want to Know, where several people have put in some questions that they would like us to answer. One of those questions is, how did we meet and why did we come to Germany?
Yes. So it all started, which we're going to answer for you now. It all started in 1996 when Andrew and I were young, spunky babes.
Cool.
So Andrew was working as a software programmer who wanted to learn a language and be fluent in a foreign language and have a stint at working overseas. And I was a struggling musician, combining piano teaching, performing as a singer, and working in a cafe. And I wanted to learn how to translate my German lieder correctly or exactly, so I knew exactly what I was singing about. So we found ourselves on the summer of 1996 at Melbourne Uni enrolled in an intensive German for beginners course. And this course is it's a course that took a year long, and it was condensed down to 6 weeks. So what you normally learnt in 1 week, you had to learn in 1 day. So it's about 6 hours contact and about during the day, and then 3 hours homework. So it was super intense. There was about 15 to 18 people in our group, and they did tell you before you enrolled that you're to block off this time and you do have no time for anything else.
Yeah, you can't do anything else. It was a really great course, very intensive, a lot of work, but very, very satisfying.
So that's how we met, and we actually got to know these 18 people really well and became good friends, because you only had time to work and do your homework, and then you'd sort of socialise very quickly in between.
Yeah.
So your schooling was...
I went to a Jesuit school in Melbourne. I was very, very lucky with my schooling. My inclination is generally towards maths and sciences, those sorts of things, but I did do a little bit of French, but I did Latin right through to my final year at school, and we had great Latin teachers. So I have a really strong grounding in grammar, and I actually love grammar. I really enjoy studying languages.
In comparison to me, I had rather bizarre schooling, and my schooling was rather experimental. They decided that grammar wasn't really necessary. So I left school barely knowing what a noun, a verb, adjective or adverb was. So we find ourselves in this very full-on course.
Yeah, and I can actually remember the very first day of this course. I was sitting in the classroom towards the front on the right-hand side. Towards the back on the left-hand side, there was a very gorgeous young woman who caught my eye immediately. I can remember you asked the question about your enrollment because you had actually changed.
Yeah.
And I thought, that's interesting. Keep an eye on her. And eventually I summoned up the courage to ask Andrea out to see a movie, and we arranged to see a movie, and she agreed.
That was Babe, if you remember when Babe, that movie about the pig
Which
came
is a
out.
movie about a pig, yes. I'm still very fond of pigs. Anyway, the day came around when we were meant to go out to this movie, and I came to Andrea and said, well, come on, let's head off to our movie together. I thought we might have done some homework beforehand. Andrea said, no, I can't go to the movie. Yes. So I need to study.
Because I actually thought he asked me out on a Friday night, and it was actually a Thursday night.
Yeah.
And we'd just done conjugating verbs in past tense. And I knew that if I didn't get my head around this, I would just be a goner and I would be lost the next day.
So she stood me up on the first date, but I persisted.
Yeah.
And
we got through that, and we got married.
Yeah, so a couple of years later, we returned to Melbourne University to get married at Trinity College Chapel, which was stunning.
Yeah.
And
promptly had a baby.
Yeah, shortly after that, Madeleine was born.
That was our Madeleine, yeah.
And and then I actually did a bit more study, and then after I finished that, I actually saw an ad in the newspaper for a job with a software company, and they were wanting to bring somebody to Germany. They said, we'll bring your family with you and set it all up and make it easy. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. But I actually thought at the time, Andrea's really happy here in Melbourne and she won't want to come. So I didn't even say anything.
Until the last minute. And then he said, oh, there is this ad. And I said to him, oh, look, just apply for it, because we can always say no. Just always apply, and we'll decide whether we want to do it or not later.
Yeah. And this was an Australian software development company looking for a software developer who spoke German. So funnily enough, I got the job. So we came over to Germany, into Frankfurt. Frankfurt's not the most beautiful city in Germany, but we thought, yeah, okay, we'll stay. We had to stay for a year. We agreed, and then we had a deal amongst ourselves that if you weren't happy, then we would go home after 1 year.
So 1 year has led into another year, and it's been sort of like a long adventure for us, and we've felt sometimes a little bit like kids on this long holiday, not wanting to go back home yet because we're not quite ready to.
It is quite fun. We still pretend to be tourists. I even pretend to be tourists. Sometimes I do very little travel, but if I go to a different town, then for work, I just pretend to be a tourist.
Yeah, so Madeleine has grown up in the German system. As you've just heard, she's just graduated. So she's grown up fluent, bilingual in English and German. She only hears English from us, but she gets her Australian accent just from the two of us. So she has the appropriate accent for the appropriate language, which is great. It means that when she speaks German, she sounds completely like a German, and she sounds like an Australian.
Yeah.
So it's been fun, and that's the story of how we met and what we're doing here.
Yeah. So we now have our interview with Carson Demers. Carson is a physiotherapist and an expert in this field. Even if you haven't had any pain with your knitting, you haven't had any problems or injuries, it's really worthwhile listening to what he has to say, because prevention is the best course to take.
Yes.
Don't get into the problems in the first place. So enjoy the interview. We think it's really interesting. He's got a lot to say, a lot of experience, a lot of knowledge, so it's really valuable. Thank you very much for being with us today. We love having your company, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time.
Bye. Welcome to the Fruity Knitting Podcast. I have a guest with me today who many of you have particularly asked me to interview, and that's Carson Demers, the author of the newly released book, Knitting Comfortably, the Ergonomics of Handknitting. Now, many of you know that I've been presently going through a pretty tough time, having to take a total break from my knitting because of a repetitive strain injury in my elbows. And for obsessive knitters like myself and many of you out there, this can feel really devastating. But the good news is repetitive strain injury can be healed and, most importantly, can be prevented. So Carson himself is a passionate knitter and a trained physiotherapist. He's been on the receiving end of physiotherapy treatment himself and has worked with many knitters who have been injured. So he's in the perfect position to be writing about this subject. The knitting world has really been waiting for this information to be presented in a cohesive and knitterly language, and Carson has now given it to us. So welcome, Carson. It's a huge privilege to have you on the Fruity Knitting podcast today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I'd like to start off with just your background as a physiotherapist and a knitter and how your book came into being.
Sure. Probably like most knitters, I started young as a kid. My mom was a knitter and she taught me how. And it took cables for me to actually want to do it. When I saw her cross a cable, I thought it was magical. So I had to learn how to do that. And I was probably about 8 or 9 at the time. I became a physical therapist a little bit later in life. I started in my late 20s to school and went to Boston University and was trained there. And when I got out of school and started practicing, I actually ended up getting some injuries myself. I went through a long rehab process. I had problems with my wrists and elbows, and it was just awful. And I learned a lot about ergonomics through the process of that, because back when I was in PT school, we didn't really talk much about ergonomics. And so I learned as much as I could. And when I was finally able to get back into clinic, I started seeing a lot of knitters coming in with the same problems that I had, knitters and spinners. So I thought, this is information that people don't generally just have lying around, and maybe I could help them by doing a book and by teaching classes. And then I went to an event, a Stitches event, around 2008, and I was taking a class with Kat Bordy. It was her advanced sock class, and Kat did something that was, in my mind, rather remarkable, which was she had the class take standing breaks. And I was so impressed and so grateful that she was doing that. So I chatted with her after class and I just said, that's terrific. And here's who I am and here's what I do. And here's why I think that's so cool. And she asked me to stay after class. Can you imagine being asked to stay after class by Kat Bordy? It was a little scary and wonderful. And when we met after class, she told me that she had always envisioned a book about ergonomics for knitters. And I said, well, so have I, and I'm sort of working on one, and what do you think about it? And she invited me to her Visionary Authors group, and I went to their next retreat, which was an incredible experience, and began the process. And I remember how daunting it felt in the beginning phases of this. I mean, I've done years of research and clinical research and just studying for the content, but so I thought that writing this book was just going to be really hard. But I'll tell you that actually the hard part, or the easy part, was the actual writing, because it's what I actually knew about. And as an independent publisher, everything else in this process has been a very, very steep learning curve. So learning who to engage to help you produce the book, and getting editors and getting artwork and artists, and now the distribution phase. If you could see the rest of my space, you'd see stacks and stacks of boxes of books and packing materials. I'm doing a big shipment this weekend because the books finally have just arrived. So that's kind of the long story, but that's how the book came into being. And Kat's been so supportive of this, as has the Visionary Authors Group, since its beginning.
Yes, I can imagine the easy part is putting down your knowledge, because that's something you'd be very passionate about and know a lot about. But just finding out how to actually make a book could be a very difficult thing. So thanks for hanging in there and sticking with it. I want to ask you, what is the main message or purpose of your book? So what do you really hope that readers will get out of your book?
what I want them to get out of it is to understand that even though knitting is lovely and pleasant and something most of us can't wait to do during the day, it's not without risk factors. It's not without use of muscles and physical energy. And whenever we have these kinds of forces that are applied to our body, we're susceptible to injury. We tend not to think about that because, unlike weightlifting or, running a marathon, knitting doesn't wear us out to the point of maximal fatigue, but it's this submaximal fatigue that gets us into trouble, just like computer use. So I want knitters to understand where this risk lives in knitting. I want them to be able to read the book and identify parts of their knitting techniques that are potentially risky and say, oh, that's me. And then I want them to follow up with the suggestions that I've made for what can you do to reduce the risk. And some of it might be very simple, what I call low-hanging fruit, like stand up every once in a while or make sure you're drinking, or higher hanging fruit, like, this tensioning technique isn't really serving me and it's causing some discomfort in my shoulder or elbow. And maybe that's something I can work on. So the book talks about risk, it talks about solutions for risk, and it talks a lot about prevention. And that sort of information is very applicable, not just to knitters, but, crochet, spinners, weavers, and certainly computer users. There's a whole chapter on computer users and how to set that space up so that it's safer to work in.
What are the typical problem areas where the majority of injuries take place, just so that a knitter can start to become aware as a preventative?
It kind of depends on the knitting technique. So I think that a lot of the knitting injuries that I've seen are driven from posture, where we actually are doing our work, and then the way that we're tensioning our yarn. And then the third thing that really jumps into this is how you've matched the yarn to the needle. So for example, with a continental knitter, there's oftentimes discomfort in this part of the elbow, and it's from a faulty kind of tensioning technique. Oftentimes with English style knitters, there's discomfort in this part of the wrist, again, from a faulty tensioning technique. I've seen shoulder problems from people who like to sit in chairs or sofas and rest on the armrest while they're knitting, and that can cause shoulder injuries. So they can come from a lot of different areas.
And just reading through your book, you talk about overuse and underuse injuries. So what's the underuse?
Well, underuse injuries are very insidious. Underuse injuries are when we don't put enough force on the tissue. And these kinds of injuries, and I like to call all the injuries, overuse and underuse, that are related to ergonomics, cumulative trauma disorder, because it really is reflective of either too much or too little force being put on the tissue consistently. So the term RSI, or repetitive strain injury, I tend not to use that just because repetition is something that's important in knitting. It's how we make our fabric. And if you're afraid of it, you probably won't want to be a knitter for very long.
Yeah.
The underuse injuries would be things like deconditioning, loss of muscle strength, loss of cardiovascular capacity, loss of range of motion. I've had knitters in class who've had blood clots in their legs because they've been so sedentary during bouts of knitting, and that's quite dangerous. Some of them have landed in the hospital. So the underuse injuries are ways that our body starts to break down, as opposed from not having enough stress, as opposed to the overuse injuries, where our body starts to break down from having too much stress applied to it.
Because there are a lot of lifestyle factors which also play a big role in avoiding injuries, aren't there? So what are some things that people can do?
So some of the things that we can do to help prevent injuries, really paying attention to all the activity that we do that involves the same postures and the same muscle groups that we use for knitting. And in today's society, that's quite a bit. We spend a lot of time seated, with elbows and shoulders flexed with some sort of grip or finger flexion activity. So certainly driving, using a keyboard, and of course knitting, all of those things. Paying attention to working in really good neutral postures whenever you can. And the reason that's so important to knitters is because in knitting, we can't always use a good neutral posture. So when we are doing things like driving and keyboarding, it's a good opportunity to employ those postures so that you've got the energy, if you will, in your energy bank to be able to spend it in knitting. Another simple thing that can be helpful is really just getting enough rest, because rest is when our body heals itself. When the broken muscle tissue heals itself is during our sleep cycle. And unfortunately, we don't get enough of that these days. So we tend to kind of overwork tissue without maximally fatiguing it. The tissue breaks down, we don't give it enough repair time, and we put it right back to work the next day. So simple things, again, good hydration, good rest, and really monitoring your overall output, even though it's not maximal.
What's also interesting is that there's quite a few different knitting styles, and people get quite attached to them and have certain beliefs about them, but there's actually pros and cons for every knitting style, isn't there, as to what's good about it and what's problematic. So can you tell us a little bit more detail about that, and where the problems are and what the good things are about the different knitting styles?
To start with, every knitting style is good. There are ways that knitting can be more efficient and safer and more productive. But knitting has changed a lot since the Industrial Revolution. And I think to start the answer to this question, we really need to know how we design tools to work. And in knitting, what we do is we have one needle that is stabilized. And I'm going to try to show you that with a bit of knitting I have in my hands. If I were an English knitter, the way that tools work best is if we have one component of the system that's stable and one component of the system that's mobile. So if you think about it, you hold the nail and you swing the hammer. You don't move them both together, and that makes work easier and more efficient. So in English knitting, and its pre-industrial revolution techniques, the right needle was stabilized. Usually the right needle was stabilized with a belt or a sheath or some other device, and the left needle would move over it. And then the yarn would be flipped, and the left needle would move out of the way. So it's right is stable, left moves, yarn is thrown, hence the term, and it's flipped. In continental knitting, it's the opposite, isn't it? It's the left needle that's still. And I have a split stitch here just at the wrong time. It's the left needle that's still. The right needle moves in, grabs the yarn, and pulls it off. So it's the left that's still. Now, we've changed the way we knit because we've kind of hybridized it. And without the use of the devices that we used to have, like for English style in particular, oftentimes both needles are moved. There's lots of inefficient ways of doing it. So in terms of English knitting, it sort of has this bad rap as a con of English knitting, is that it's terribly inefficient. And it's actually doesn't need to be. One of the things that makes it inefficient is the typical tensioning and throwing technique that knitters will use. So what they'll often do is they'll have the wool parallel to the receiving needle. And if you can sort of imagine what the trajectory of this is, I have 360 degrees that I have to traverse to get this back into a position where I can slip it off the needle. That takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of pinch grip. So it can result in some discomfort in this part of the arm. The pro of this is that when you actually do put the yarn and the needles in good orientation, and I'll tell you about that in just a second because it doesn't matter what technique you're using, you can actually go quite quickly with English style knitting. You can really just kind of zip along with it. With continental knitting, so you can see now that my working yarn is in the same direction as my receiving needle, and as I tension it, those stitches want to come off. So continental knitters will often have to pinch or hold this, and then when they dig in here, it's such a long way to grab that yarn that it becomes inefficient. And what it does is it creates a very prolonged and static contraction in the wrist and finger extensors, and that can lead to a tendonitis. You can also get similar things happening down here in the wrist. Of course, when either of these techniques are used in their purer form, where we have a mobile unit on a stable unit, they're both very, very efficient techniques.
The original people who were knitting had to knit a lot of hours a day efficiently because it was their income, wasn't it? So they had to find a method that worked and they weren't going to get injuries.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And of course, the Industrial Revolution and knitting machines really changed all of that. the sort of cottage industry knitter wasn't able to use that anymore. But when they were, we have this wonderful, rich history of being very mobile, and that's one of the wonderful things about knitted fabric or making knitted fabric is you can do it on the go, can't you? You can knit in line at the store, you can take walks and knit, and it's very, very portable kind of thing. Yeah.
And the other thing I often think about is our ancestors were so much fitter than us. They had to do what they had to do simply to wash their clothes or bake their bread was using so many more muscles that they were really in a good physical condition generally.
I'll say that there definitely were less sedentary, and I think that among knitters in particular, one of the problems that we have as a group, as a community, is that we tend to be very sedentary, and we've made knitting a very sedentary activity, and in part because most knitters aren't involved in creating the yarn that they are using or what their resources are. So, if you went back to Shetland in the 1800s, early 1800s, you would have probably had to pick wool and card it and do all these other, spinning and all these other activities. And maybe even with a drop spindle while you were walking to get your peat or what have you.
Yes.
So yeah, we've become much more sedentary, and knitting has for us become a very fine motor activity and not using the larger muscle groups. So, to your earlier question, Andrea, in terms of lifestyle things, that's why exercise is so important. And if we are going to to be sustainable knitters, we need to do something to make sure that we get that to happen and use those larger groups of muscles.
And in your book, you've got a chapter about tools and how you can pair different needles with different kinds of yarns. And you also talk about triangular and square-shaped needles. So can you just briefly tell us a little bit about that?
Yarn and needle pairing is really something that every knitter needs to learn, I think, first lesson. And there are a few things that are really important. And the reason that they're important is they will either they'll either create the requirement of more muscle energy on your part, or they'll make your knitting easy and more efficient. So the first is, how much friction is there between the needle and the yarn? So if you've got a very slick yarn, maybe you're doing a worsted spun silk, and you try to do that on a very slick needle, like maybe a nickel-plated needle, your hands are going to have to work very hard to keep that system together, because the stitches are going to want to fly right off. So you want to sort of pair them complementary. And I always think that it's an important part of the swatching phase is to actually use different kinds of needles and see what's going to be a good match. The next thing that you want to look for is the tip of the needle. And we're so lucky these days that we have lots of choices, not just in terms of the sharpness of the tip, but the length of the tip as well. So stitch patterns that have multiple stitches involved in a particular manipulation, they need to have a longer tip, because that's where you get the extra space to fit your needle into. And then the sharpness, of course, will be determined by the kind of yarn that you're working with, the spin of the yarn that you're working with. So if you've got something that's really kind of splitty, you probably aren't going to want a very sharp needle, because it's just going to get into those spaces and not be a very pleasant experience.
Yeah, so what you're saying then is you want to avoid having the small muscle groups constantly in a state of tension, or you want to keep them as relaxed as possible. Is that right? And so that's why you would want to have a more stickier yarn with a slippery needle, so that you're not having to tense your muscles up a little bit extra just to keep it from sliding off. Have I got that right?
Yeah, you don't really want to have any muscle that's in a static contraction, but particularly the smaller muscles, so the finger flexors and finger extensors, those extreme long durations of that contraction decreases circulation to those muscles, and it can be up to 60%. So that's a significant loss of oxygen and removal of waste product and all that kind of stuff. So we are lucky that we have lots of different shaped needles too. And historically, our needles have been cylindrical, and that's great. But there are a couple of reasons that shape can create discomfort for a knitter. There's a risk factor called contact stress, and contact stress refers to the ratio of force over area that your body is contacting. So if you can imagine looking at the cross-section of a cylindrical needle, and you can imagine your finger going on it, the pressure wouldn't be even across the arc of that needle. It would be greatest at the apex of touch. As our hands age, we tend to lose a little range of motion in this last knuckle and other knuckles in the fingers, but particularly this last knuckle, and we tend to lose some padding on the tip of our fingers. And when that happens, holding that arc onto the arc of that needle can be really uncomfortable for knitters. So enter the alternately shaped needle, which is wonderful. And we have lots of choices these days. We have square needles, and then they come in a variety of materials that they're made from. And the advantage of a square needle is that it has an even surface, so it's a flatter surface. And if you remember that contact stress is a ratio of force over area, the area of contact is larger and it's more uniform, so that you don't feel that, it's kind of like if you're sitting on a railed fence to watch a ball game or something versus sitting in a chair to watch the ball game.
Yeah.
That rail is really uncomfortable. So the square needle can make that much more comfortable. There are other shape needles out there too. There were triangular shapes for a while. I haven't seen them for a while. I didn't find a triangular needle very comfortable in my hand because no matter how you hold it, you've got an edge. And I should say that with square needles, that's true too. If you're holding the square needle incorrectly, so that you've got the edge of the square in your finger, that's not going to feel good at all either. The other thing that a flat surface does on a needle, particularly with modern knitters who are using some sort of hybridized style, there's usually a point during stitch creation where one of the needles is let go of and the yarn is moved or the stitch is moved. And when that happens, one hand is trying to stabilize both needles at the same time. If you have a round surface on a round surface, it's going to take a little bit more force because it's so unstable. But if you have a flat surface against a flat surface, it just holds more easily for you to do your manipulation. So it can translate to less stress on your hands.
Okay, that's very interesting because people with arthritis sometimes say that they find it easier, don't they, with square needles?
Absolutely. Usually it's the larger sizes of round needles that cause problems to people. And so using a larger, it's up to the individual, but for me, a 4 or a 5 would be a pretty big needle, certainly a 7 or an 8. So when you get up to those sizes, it really is appreciable.
Okay, so right now listening to us in the audience, there's probably some knitters who are knitting away with pain. So my question is, what's your advice to them? How would they be able to assess themselves whether they just simply need to stop knitting for 2 or 3 weeks and they're going to be fine, or whether they actually need to go and get some good advice from a doctor or a therapist? And if that's the case and they have to go to a professional, what kinds of things should they look out for when they're choosing a doctor or a therapist? Because in my case, I found that there's quite a lot of ambiguity in the advice that's given amongst doctors and physiotherapists.
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first part of the question, what should they do and when should they seek help? My first recommendation is if you're having discomfort, you need to stop in the moment and see what happens to the pain. If it's lasting and it's not going away, that's a red flag. Pain is always a signal. So I always think it's important to stop and try to sort out where you think it's coming from. And often we can do that. You realize, oh, I'm sitting funny or I'm doing whatever, and you can just adjust and correct it. But if that's not the case, if it starts again when you go back to the activity, or you find it happening with other activities like computing or other kinds of hand related tasks, I think it's time to do some investigation. And in my book, while my book is not designed as a treatment aid, it does talk about some early intervention techniques that you can try. Generally, overuse injuries like a tendonitis or maybe a muscle strain should self-resolve with some self-care in a couple of weeks. And that includes decreasing the force that you've put onto the tissue or that you put onto the tissue. So maybe backing down on your knitting, backing down and using better postures at the computer, those kinds of things. And my advice is that if it's not getting better using those self-treatment early intervention techniques, then it's definitely time for help, because you don't want these to turn into chronic problems. The other time that I recommend getting help really quickly is if you're experiencing any change in sensation, so numbness or tingling, or a feeling of electricity or coldness moving down your arm or leg or whatever. Those are probably signals of some kind of nerve impairment, and you want to get that checked because it just takes so long for those things to repair if you're not doing it in a sort of uh, guided way with somebody that needs some help, that can give you some help. Now, you asked me about where to find the help and who to find, and you mentioned that there's a lot of variance in the kind of treatment you get from people, and I think that that's true. Um, there are a lot of methodologies out there to treat musculoskeletal injuries, and oftentimes, at least here in the U.S., a physician's going to recommend, let's say, for a carpal tunnel problem, they'll probably a brace, some anti-inflammatories, and tell you to rest. I think that those are all, probably very appropriate things. And hopefully they're going to refer you to physical therapy, because the PT is the person who really understands the mechanics, the biomechanics, the kinesiology, and the soft tissue sort of rehab process. Now, I'm the first to admit that there's a lot of variety in the kind of PTs that you'll find out there. And so to help you along, I would look for somebody who has a real good understanding of, they're probably going to call them repetitive strain injuries, but it's almost a specialty. It's sort of like if you went to work to PT for somebody who specializes in knees. Maybe you've had an ACL repair. You want someone who's really good with knees or a back problem. So asking those kinds of questions is important, and finding somebody who's really skilled at working with soft tissue injuries and nerve tension injuries is I think useful. I think too often we just sort of take the first therapist or doctor that comes along, and you get to ask questions before you enter into a care relationship with that provider.
That's such good advice, and that's so true from my experience. Just to finish off with, for me, the topic wouldn't be complete if we didn't talk or mention the psychological and emotional tensions that we all go through just simply as being human beings. And a lot of that is subconscious and some of it's conscious, and how that affects our bodies and our muscles. And just in my own journey of trying to figure out what my injury problem is, I came across the work of Dr. Sarno, who's now in his 90s, and probably his most famous or well-read book is Healing Back Pain. But he's worked with thousands of people who've had suffered from chronic pain for many, many years, and then have been healed through better understanding the mind-body connection. So I'm just wanting to know what your thoughts are on this topic and your experience.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really important point. Whenever we have stress, psychological stress or emotional stress, it's often manifested physically. And what we often will do is tense our shoulders or grit our teeth or clench our neck. And that creates, again, these sustained muscular contractions, which, as I mentioned earlier, decrease circulation to this tissue. There's actually a reprogramming of the brain when we start to make these associations, when we start to get into this sort of chronic pain situation, and even the pathways literally change. The pain pathways literally change. So it's not a trivial thing, and these injuries can kind of go on and on and on because you actually need to retrain that. And Sarno talks about that. Another thing that happens with these kinds of injuries is that there's a little sort of tube, if you will, that the nerve fibers travel through, and that whole pathway can get sticky. So you develop this sort of tension along the nervous system, and I think that Sarno probably talks a bit about that, and certainly David Butler, who's done a lot of research on that, talks about it in his work. And it's one of those things that just the thought of the activity can bring on the discomfort again. I had a knitter once who had knitted for quite a long time, and she loved it, but she said that she always had neck and shoulder pain after she knitted, and this was for like 55 years that she had been knitting. And when I was working with her, every time she would touch her needles, she would do this. and she wasn't aware of it. So it was this psychological thing that I guess when she was learning to knit, she was afraid that, I don't know, the stitches would fall off or what have you. But
Yeah.
for her, it just translated into this stressful thing, even though she enjoyed the act of knitting. And untraining that is not as simple as it might sound. It really takes some mindfulness and some work. But you're absolutely right that the psychological component is very, very important. And, as a knitter, if you've been injured, it's really scary to think, should I pick it up again or shouldn't I pick it up again? And I think that that's kind of the point in the road that many of us are at, and I certainly was at it when I had my injury. Should I avoid knitting or not? And if I may, I would say, test it. Test it by starting with small bits of knitting, small bouts of knitting. So maybe you go for 5 minutes, really mindfully. I in these situations where you're almost working with this as rehab, I always like to work in a swatch, not a project, because there's no stress in a swatch. Who cares what happens?
Yeah.
And focusing on your breathing and focusing on relaxing your shoulders, just almost meditatively, to help you get through that barrier and bring it into the rest of your knitting projects.
Yeah, that's really, really great advice. Just to finish off with, how do viewers go about getting your book?
Yes, they can buy it from my website. Unfortunately, one of the big distributors of craft books is no more. And so indie publishers like myself are, here goes the learning curve, are doing distribution and fulfillment. And believe me, this is a really hard part for me. So I'm doing shipping orders, in fact, today. I don't have a distribution stream in Europe or Australia or New Zealand, but you can certainly order them, and I can quote pricing for shipping. There are a couple of different options for that. And I will have somebody in Canada that you can buy from their website, and that's going to be set up in probably the next week or so. And they will be coming to local yarn shops, at least in the States, pretty soon. I mean, the books literally just arrived this week, and they're on their way out to yarn shops now. So I hope you can find it in your local shop soon.
Great. Well, Carson, thank you so much for giving us your time on the podcast. It's been really lovely. You're an incredibly sympathetic person, and I think people are going to find that and read that through your book. And I have to say, you also look very gorgeous in your hand-knitted jumper.
Thanks very much.
Well, it has been really a privilege to get to know you and to talk in more detail about this subject with you. And I think that knitters should just go out there and be aware of what you've got to help them with. I think it's a very important thing. And I want to thank you again for coming and being on the podcast with us.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Great talking with you.